You reach for your phone to call them. Then you remember. They're gone. Maybe you set the table for two before you catch yourself. Maybe a song comes on and you turn to say something, and the chair next to you is empty. This happens to almost everyone who has lost someone, and for a long time, people called it weakness or denial, something you were supposed to get over. But here's the strange part. What if grief isn't a malfunction at all? What if it's one of the oldest, most carefully tuned systems your brain has ever run, and it's been running since long before anyone wrote anything down? Let's think about your ancestors for a moment. Not the ones from 100 years ago, the ones before history, before writing, before farming. Even then, they buried their dead. In a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar, archaeologists found Neanderthal remains buried more than 50,000 years ago. Some bodies were placed carefully, curled into deliberate positions. Around one skeleton, researchers found clusters of ancient pollen, possibly the remains of flowers laid into the grave. That detail is still debated. Some scientists think the pollen arrived by accident, carried in by burrowing animals. But the burials themselves are not in question. Bodies were placed on purpose, sometimes covered with stones, sometimes arranged in specific positions, again and again, across tens of thousands of years. Here's the question. Why would anyone bother? Burying a body takes time. It takes energy. In a world where every hour not spent hunting, gathering, or watching for predators was an hour that could get you killed, digging a hole for someone who can no longer help you find food or fight off a threat seemed like a strange use of resources. And yet, they did it, again and again, across different times, different places, different species of early humans. You can see traces of something similar outside our own species, too. Elephants have been observed returning again and again to the bones of dead herd members, touching the skulls gently with their trunks, sometimes standing over them in silence for stretches of time. Chimpanzees have been seen carrying the bodies of dead infants for days, grooming them as if they were still alive. Whatever this is, it didn't start with humans. It runs deep in the wiring of social animals in general.
So there has to be a reason. Something this costly, repeated this consistently, is usually doing something important. The answer starts with a researcher named John Bowlby. In the 1950s, Bowlby was studying something that seemed completely unrelated to grief, the bond between infants and the people who care for them. He called it attachment. His research showed that this bond isn't just a feeling, it's a survival system. A baby separated from its caregiver doesn't just feel sad. It searches, it cries, it scans the room again and again, looking for the one person who keeps it alive. Bowlby's key insight was this: attachment doesn't switch off just because the relationship changes or ends. Which means, when someone you're deeply attached to dies, your brain doesn't get a memo. It doesn't update instantly. The part of your mind that learned this person exists and I can find them doesn't know they're gone. Not at first, and honestly, not all at once ever. This is where the neuroscience gets genuinely strange. Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor, a neuroscientist who has spent years studying grief inside brain scanners, describes something she calls the grieving brain. Her research suggests that grief isn't simply an emotion sitting in one tidy part of your head, waiting to be felt on schedule. It's closer to a search. Your brain spent years, sometimes decades, building a kind of map. A map of where this person is, what they sound like, how they'll react, when you'll see them next. That map gets checked constantly, automatically, without you ever noticing. Walk into the kitchen, some part of your brain expects them there. Hear a phone buzz, some part of your brain assumes it might be them. When someone dies, that map doesn't get deleted. It gets contradicted, over and over again. Every time you reach for the phone, every time you set out 2 plates, every time you start to say, wait until I tell them, and stop. Your brain ran the old map. Reality disagreed. And that collision between what your brain expects and what's actually true is a huge part of what grief actually feels like, moment to moment.
This explains something that confused researchers for a long time. Why does grief come in waves? Why can you feel almost fine for hours, then suddenly get hit by a wave of pain triggered by something as small as a smell, a song, or an empty parking spot? Because your brain isn't grieving on a schedule. It's grieving every single time that old map gets activated and contradicted again. Smell is especially powerful here. A particular perfume, a brand of soap, the inside of a car. These can trigger a wave of grief faster than almost anything else, because smell connects directly into some of the oldest, most emotional parts of the brain, bypassing the slower, more analytical regions that usually filter things first. That's why a stranger wearing the same cologne can stop you cold in the middle of a grocery store. For decades, popular psychology taught that grief moves through 5 neat stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, in that order, like a checklist. That model came from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it originally described how dying patients coped with their own deaths, not how the people they left behind grieved afterward. Most modern grief researchers, including O'Connor, are clear that real grief doesn't move in a straight line through stages like that. It moves in waves. It comes back. It can ambush you a year later on a random afternoon for no obvious reason, until you realize it's the anniversary of something your conscious mind had almost forgotten, but your body hadn't. So, if grief is this search and update process, quietly running inside an ancient attachment system, what does that have to do with burying the dead 50,000 years ago? Here's the connection. Attachment isn't just something that happens to individuals. For social animals like us, it's part of what holds the group together. Trust, cooperation, the willingness to share food, to defend each other, to help raise each other's children if something happens. A death in a small group of 50 people is not a minor event. It's a disruption to the entire web of relationships everyone depends on to survive. Some researchers argue that mourning rituals, burying the dead, marking the place, returning to it later, may have served a function beyond emotion. They gave the group a shared, structured way to process that disruption together. A way to say, collectively, this person mattered. This bond still counts, even now. We are still a group, even with this hole in it. In other words, grief rituals may not only be about the person who died, they may also be about keeping everyone else attached to each other. This reframes something about modern grief that often gets misunderstood. When people say, "I need closure," what they're often reaching for isn't really about the person who's gone. It's about their own internal map. About finally getting that prediction system to update, to stop quietly expecting a phone call that will never come, or a car in the driveway that will never pull in again. And that updating takes time, not because you're weak, not because you're not over it yet, as if grief were a deadline you missed. It takes time because your brain is doing something genuinely complex. It's slowly rewriting a map that took years, sometimes decades, to build in the first place, one quiet correction at a time. There's another piece of this that surprises people. For most of human history, and still in many cultures today, the dead weren't simply removed from the world of the living. They were kept close. Graves were placed near living spaces, not far away. Anniversaries, festivals, and rituals were built around continuing to include the dead in some form, speaking to them, leaving them food, telling their stories to children they never met. Modern grief researchers have a name for this too: continuing bonds. The idea that healthy grieving doesn't always mean letting go completely. Sometimes it means finding a different kind of relationship with the memory of that person, one that doesn't require them to be physically present anymore. This might explain why so many people who've lost someone still talk to them, out loud sometimes, and their heads often. Ask them for advice, imagine what they'd say about something. Feel like they're still with them in some quiet way they can't quite explain. For a long time, that was treated as a problem, a sign you hadn't moved on. But the research on continuing bonds, alongside what we know about ancient burial sites, where the dead were kept close, spoken to, remembered, marked, suggests something else entirely. Maybe that instinct isn't a failure to let go. Maybe it's exactly what humans have always done, for tens of thousands of years. So back to that moment. You reach for the phone. You catch yourself. That reflex, the one that feels embarrassing almost, isn't a glitch. It's not your brain failing to get the memo. It's your brain doing exactly what brains have done for as long as there have been humans burying their dead with care, running the map it built over years of love, hitting a contradiction, and quietly, slowly, rewriting itself around the hole that's still being mapped. It's not weakness. It's not being stuck. It's not failing some 5-step checklist. It's an ancient, social, deeply wired process, the same one that 50,000 years ago made a small group of humans pause whatever they were doing, dig into hard ground, and carefully place someone they loved into it. They didn't do that because they understood neuroscience. They did it because something in them needed to. The same something is in you. So the next time you reach for the phone to call someone who's gone, or set the table for one too many, try not to flinch away from it. That's not your mind betraying you. That's the oldest part of being human, still quietly doing its job, still drawing the map, one correction at a time, of someone who mattered enough to bury 50,000 years ago and who matters enough for you to still reach for today.